welcome to another edition of CiviCast, a series of podcasts from the National Civic Impact Accelerator, funded by Research England. I'm John Fell, Senior Policy Advisor at the NCIA. In this episode, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Julian Dobson, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research, or CRESA for short, at Sheffield Hallam University. CRESA are one of the key delivery partners of the NCIA programme. Julian, thanks very much for being here. It's great to talk to you on the campus of Sheffield Hallam today about the work you and NCIA colleagues are doing to create a theory of civic change. But just before we get into that, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your background. You came from a journalism background before moving into academia. Is that correct?
That's right. I had quite a long career in journalism, working for local newspapers. I worked for a trade union for a bit. Then I worked for myself. I eventually ended up specialising around housing, local government, health, some of those kind of public services, and edited a magazine called Inside Housing for a few years, and then left that with some colleagues to set up my own business, which was a magazine publishing company which published a magazine around urban regeneration. So I did that for just over 10 years, and that's informed a lot of what I do now.
Coming from a non-academic background, do you think that's had any advantages or disadvantages?
It's made a difference in a number of ways. Rather than being the kind of academic who has a very particular specialist niche that they know everything about and the world expert on, I know a number of things about a large number of things. And I'm very much about joining the dots, linking things in, working in an interdisciplinary way across different subjects, different areas of activity, and linking academic research with policy and practice. So it's very much about that kind of bridging role where I see myself. And I think increasingly there's a need for that in academia.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme I'm noticing in conversations around the civic university space, that there's a real benefit to having experience of people who've been in other sectors, other industries, and then come into the university space and bring that knowledge and contacts perhaps as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's not to decry the specialist knowledge of people who've gone through the traditional academic routes, the professors with all their amazing knowledge and research activity. But it's about how do we link that up with the wider world in a way that shows that this academic work is not only relevant, but also that it's important to do in its own right. So it's about informing the wider world of the work of the university, because I think there's quite a lot of ignorance about what universities actually do beyond training undergraduates to get degrees. It's also about encouraging a more outward-looking approach within the university itself, which is very much what the Civic University movement and the NCIA are about.
Absolutely. So in late 2023, last year, you spoke at a conference at the University of Hasselt in Belgium.
Yeah, Hasselt is an interesting place. It's in the middle of a former coal mining area. So from that point of view, quite a few parallels with South Yorkshire, although Hasselt does look a lot more prosperous than a lot of the towns and cities in former coal mining places in the UK. What's also interesting is that it's a very recent university. So this was their 50th anniversary conference. So they were set up in the 70s at a time when deindustrialization was really looming over the horizon. So being set up with a specific civic mission as a university for their region, I think gave them a different perspective than you see in some of the more traditional universities in the UK, where the connection between university and city is perhaps less prominent. So it was quite interesting to be in that space and to be somewhere where the idea of the civic university is gaining some traction. At the same time, it was quite interesting to note that civic, in the sense of that it was being used by a lot of people in Hasselt, was very much about training students to be good citizens rather than the role of the university as an institution in their region. That organisational role, I think in some ways hasn't actually filtered through to the academic staff en masse. I mean, there are certain departments where it's very, very strong. So I heard some very, very good work from their architecture department where they've been working with local communities. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's not consistent. And I think that in many ways kind of is a parallel situation to what you see in UK universities.
I'll put a link to your blog in the text with this podcast so people can go and read that straight after they've heard this podcast if they'd like to hear some more about your experience in Hasselt. So we're here to talk about the theory of civic change that you and NCIA colleagues have been developing. So I guess my first question is, what is a theory of change?
Well, that's a very good question. It sounds very erudite, doesn't it? But actually, it's a map. It's a way of saying how you get from A to B and why you think the road you're taking is the right one. So if A is a bunch of people in a university talking amongst themselves, and B is an engaged university that is really involved in the work of its city or region or town and has mature and working partnerships with local stakeholders in order to do things that make a difference within the community, then the theory of change is about how you get from a bunch of university people talking to themselves to that engaged state. So you can have a theory of change for almost anything that is a plan, but especially anything that's quite a complex plan. What a theory of change encourages you to do is think about who you are, what you want to do, why you think the things that you want to do will result in the changes that you think they're going to result in, and what resources do you need to make those happen, what activities do you need to engage in, what effects do you think they'll have, what will change, and what the long-term impact is going to be. And you can make it as simple or as sophisticated as you like. And some theories of change are incredibly detailed and complex, and you almost need a theory of change to understand what's going on when you look at them. But at its most basic level, it's a way of encouraging you to ask the questions. Why do you think the thing that you've proposed is going to result in the changes that you say it's going to result in? And actually, if you look across government, if you look at some of the kind of mega projects that run way over budget or that end up being cancelled or scrapped, you look at something like HS2. Yeah, what was the theory of change there? Why did they think that activity would result in the economic benefits that were ascribed to it? And did it stack up in a logical way? And you might say yes, you might say no, but actually often you look at some of those big projects and they just come from a kind of political imperative. Huge amounts of investment are shoveled away to make these things happen, but no one's really interrogated why you think that initiative is going to result in the change that is attributed to it. So a theory of change is basically a way of saying, ask some really simple, obvious questions and ask them thoroughly. So when we're talking about the Civic University, because the Civic University is quite a kind of fuzzy idea, and it's quite contestable and contested. People have all sorts of different ideas of what it should be relating to what their particular interest or their particular pet project might be. You need a way of bringing all these conversations together and saying, what do we really mean by this? What's it going to do? Who needs to be on board with this? Who are the partners that we need to work with? And who is it for? Who are the ultimate beneficiaries? If it's just to produce something that a vice-chancellor can wave around at some policy forum or in meetings with governments, does that make a real difference within the communities that are affected? Is civic for the benefit of the university, or is it actually for the benefit of the place? If you look at the kind of work that's been going on by the likes of John Goddard, by the Civic University Commission, there's a kind of decade of work which is about saying, this is about the place and it's about being for the good of the place. But what we found as we were developing the theory of change is that actually no one anywhere has really kind of defined what it means to be a civic university. Yeah, there's a lot of descriptions and a lot of descriptions of things that civic universities do, most of which are really good. You know, if you take some of the work that's been going on here at Hallam with South Yorkshire Futures, great work, but South Yorkshire Futures isn't a definition of a civic university. It's one of the things that a civic university might do. So this process got us into a discussion about, okay, how do we define our terms? What do we really mean by a civic university? And we actually came up with a number of statements, if you like, about what is a civic university, because what we found is these statements hadn't actually been made before. So we spent some months thrashing them out among colleagues with the different NCIA partners to try and come to something that we were all happy with.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common question. I think I've probably asked it myself on these podcasts a few times. What do we mean by a civic university? So do you feel that your theory of change, or this NCIA theory of change that you and colleagues have worked on, do you think is there a definitive answer? How do you approach that?
Well, the theory of change doesn't give you that, but the definition gives you a starting point for the theory of change. So You need the definition before you can even get on with producing a theory of change, which is why we spent so long putting this together. So we came up with a number of statements that actually says, to the best of our knowledge, this is what we think we all agree on, which is, first of all, that we understand the university's civic activities as collaborative and inclusive relationships and practices that happen for the benefit of a place towards a set of outcomes that are co-produced with local institutions, leaders and populations. And there's quite a lot to unpack in that. A civic mission, people refer to civic missions a lot of the time. So what we say is a civic mission is a choice by universities to recognise the value and potential of those relationships and practices and invest in them to agreed outcomes. You know, not every university is civic or has a civic mission, but where a university chooses to fly that flag, they're saying, okay, this is the flag you're flying. Civic engagement, which is another thing people always talk about, is that process of building and improving locally beneficial relationships. So it's the conversations that take place. And civic impact is a description of the outcomes that come from that. So actually having those statements in place allows you to start having a conversation about, okay, not just what do we mean by this, but how are we going to do it, which is what we're all really interested in. But if we're confused about what we really mean, we might end up being very confused about what we actually do as well. If that's what we mean by being civic, what does it look like? So if the initial statement is the A of the map and the B of where we're trying to get to is what it looks like, we then need to start thinking about what does it look like where, for which people, in what circumstances. So in creating a theory of civic change, what we're doing is creating a framework that people can use to ask those questions. But actually in each location, a civic university will want to construct its own theory of change. There isn't like a menu that you can pull one down from and say, okay, here's a model of being civic. We'll take that and Bob's your uncle, off we go. It's more tricky than that because it's about asking, what are the needs in your community that you want to meet? Why do you think the university has a particular role there? Who is it working with to meet those needs? What's the end goal from that? What do you want to do by doing that? Is it about boosting the local economy? Is it about tackling inequalities? Is it about addressing some of those much bigger issues like climate change, like the biodiversity crisis, like the kind of crisis that we're seeing across Europe and in America in terms of a loss of confidence in democracy? So there's some quite big things going on. And the university has a role as a civic institution. Whether it wants to, whether it chooses that role or not, it's got a role because it's a player in that process. The question is, what kind of player does it want to be?
Do you see that universities, people who read your theory of civic change, can use this as a way to create their own? How do you see it being applied?
It's a conversation starter. I think all of these things are conversation starters. the work that we previously did around the Civic Impact Framework, which fed into this in quite a big way, was very much about saying there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There isn't a single common civic destination for universities. It looks different in different places, but there are questions that you need to ask, which are all about what if we did things differently? What kind of place do we want to create here? What's our vision for what a good society looks like, if you like? What role does the university have to play in that? So if you take a city like Sheffield, you've got 2 universities, they're big players in the city. They employ lots of people. They have impacts on supply chains. They bring students, thousands and thousands of students into the city every year, not just to train those people and give them an education, a degree, but also in terms of that kind of personal formation that makes them a citizen of whether it's South Yorkshire or some place that they go back to. So the university has a really important role in terms of the future of the place, the kind of cohorts of people who contribute to the place in the future, but also the future of place in terms of what it looks like, the buildings that are here. If you look at Sheffield, the 2 universities occupy a massive footprint in the city centre. So what impact are they having on the way people feel about the place, people's experience of the place? Do people look at those buildings and say, this is great, this makes me feel good about being here? Or do they think, what's that?
The impact is always travelling to Sheffield by train and see the Hallam buildings and the Hallam brand quite prominent across the skyline. It makes me feel quite proud to work here. But for maybe somebody who's had not a great experience working or studying here, it might have the same impact, a negative impact.
Yeah, I mean, Hallam's in a really interesting position because, as you say, it's really in your face. It's the first thing you see if you come to the city by train or if you're coming down the parkway. And so the impression it gives is, for better or worse, an impression of the city to an outsider. So what is this conglomeration of buildings and the activities that go on inside them and the people who inhabit them? What's that saying about the city? And it will say something immediately to you as you arrive, but then as you get to know it, as you as someone who works here are finding, you start to feel differently. Your pride isn't just because you've seen the Hallam logo when you come into town, but it's because you've experienced working within this institution and the support of colleagues and the shared goals that come from that. So in a sense, that's part of a university's civic impact, but it can also be specifically part of a university's civic work. And the distinction I'm making there is that if it's part of a university's civic work, then it becomes something that's deliberate and conscious. You have civic impacts, whether you intend to or not. Some of them are positive, some of them less so. You look at universities' impacts on housing markets. A lot of them are very far from positive. Conglomerations of student accommodation, which tend to be quite inimical to good placemaking. So universities don't always have positive impacts. They also often reinforce social divides. If you look at the divides in Sheffield, east-west in terms of deprivation, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of income and affluence, you'll find a vast majority of the university staff live on the west side of the city. So that engagement as an institution within the city, however well-meaning, is also having some relatively negative effects in that it's reinforcing social divides, reinforcing house prices, which then may become unaffordable to local people, reinforces things like school choices, which again, if your better performing schools are occupied by the children of university staff, it's then much more difficult for the children of people who might be in less well-paid jobs, working in more kind of fragile occupations, to get into those schools. So you have a kind of generational effect on life choices, not just life choices, but life chances. It's important that the university is aware of these effects. And where the theory of civic change comes in, it gives a tool that enables university leaders across the institution as a whole or across individual faculties and departments to be able to have those conversations. So what are the impacts that we're having? What are the impacts that we'd like to have? Who do we need to work with to change those?
Could you tell me a bit about who's worked on the Theory of Civic Change with you in the NCIA programme and how's it been put together?
It was clear that we needed to do this work because there was still this going around in circles about what do we really mean. Very shortly after we'd kind of, across our different organisations, recruited the key staff for the programme. The work really started once we'd got those key people in, Zoe and Gemma at NCCPE, Femi Owolade working with me at CRASA, and within Institute of Community Studies, Tanya and Jacob. The conversation has been wider than that, but particularly NCCPE have made a big contribution. ICS have made a big contribution in terms of just helping to see what we're trying to do from different perspectives and from their experience of working both within multiple universities, but also in community organisations and community partners and in government. So the process was kicked off really with a workshop that we did in CRASA to try and draft out something that people could work with. And it's then gone through various iterations and comments and reviews. And so it's very much a team effort.
You talked about the Action Learning Programme and the importance of the Theory of Civic Change. So could you tell me a bit more about your involvement with the Action Learning Programme and how the Theory of Civic Change supports that work?
The Theory of Civic Change gives the participants in the Action Learning Programme something that they can work with and take back to their partnerships and universities. They don't have to, but it's there if they want it, and I think it would be helpful. The role that we have with the Action Learning groups, CRASA, is slightly different. So we're there as observers of a process of action learning that is being facilitated by NCCPE. Action learning is about people coming together in their own partnerships and working out their challenges and opportunities for themselves in a facilitated forum and learning from their peers. And our role is to observe all of this and to try and understand where kind of institutional change is taking place or can take place. So what we're trying to do is step back from the immediate conversations that are going on in those groups and say, what can we learn about becoming a civic university for the whole of the sector? And that will both inform the kind of continuous development of the theory of civic change, but be informed hopefully by it. So at the one hand, we've got a theoretical model that says this is how universities can get from A to B in being more civic. And on the other hand, we've got the practical experience of 12 cohorts of people from different partnerships who have all got different experiences of working in civic teams. And those experiences might be quite fragmented. It might be that they represent only a little bit of their institution. And so what we're trying to do is start to join up some of that stuff and say, on the one hand, you've got this very situated experience of the participants in the action learning process, and on the other, you've got this theoretical model. And how do you bring those together in order to produce something that pulls out learning for the wider higher education sector in a way that is learnable, in a way that makes sense? You could just say, here's the experiences of 12 partnerships engaged in the action learning, and that doesn't tell you anything much apart from these other stories of these people and these organisations and these places. The analysis that we'll be doing from the action learning groups and linking that with the theory of civic change is about saying, how do you start to generalise that learning, and how do you start to make it implementable across the higher education sector, and what are the wider lessons for the sector and for funders and for government about how universities are resourced, how civic activity within universities are resourced, and what are the needs of different places that can be met through universities' civic work, or how can universities' civic work contribute to meeting those needs?
So how does the theory of civic change link to previous work that's been done in the civic university space, such as the Civic Impact Framework?
As part of the previous work that we were doing with the Civic University network in Crozer, we developed a Civic Impact Framework, which was a way of thinking about how do you assess the difference that universities are making. And part of the reason for that was that there was a lot of call within the sector for some sort of metric that would tell you whether is a civic university good or not. Is it being civic? Here's some boxes that will tell you, on the scale for 1 to 10, how civic is your institution. And we thought about this and had a look at it. And in the end, we decided not to go with quantitative metrics. And that's not because quantitative metrics have no value, but they can be distracting and they can often obscure rather than reveal what you really want to know. So if you're thinking about what kind of difference a civic university might want to make, we actually mapped 7 areas where a civic university could, would, should make a difference. And some of those are internal and some of those are external. So we thought organisational strategy and leadership, the vision of the university, the leadership of the university is key. The social impact of the university in terms of what difference does it make to social equalities or inequalities? How is it addressing those beyond simply giving people opportunities to get a degree? What about their impact on the environment? What's the carbon footprint of the university? What does the way the university go about its business? What impact does that have on the environment of the place? What about their contribution to local well-being and health? What about their contribution to the cultural health and wealth of their place? And then their economic contribution, which obviously is the where a lot of the work on civic universities has come from and is important but isn't the only thing. Finally, what impact does the university have on place in terms of its footprint, its facilities, who can use those facilities, what impression do they make on the public, what contribution do they make in terms of urban design, that sort of thing. So we identified those 7 areas where universities can make a civic difference. So when you think about the theory of change, if you assume that a university actually wants to make a difference across those 7 areas, or maybe has prioritised 2 or 3 of them where it's going to make a difference to start with, the theory of change then allows you to start to plot out where are you now, where do you want to get to, how are we going to get there, and how do we know that the methods we've chosen for getting there are the right ones. So they're complementary bits of work and they fit together. The theory of civic change allows us to think about how the Civic Impact Framework can be operationalised. We're aware that people's needs for information are very different. So we've got a very short FAQ about what is a civic university. We've got a plain English version of the theory of civic change, which tries to set out as simply as possible what do we mean by a theory of civic change, what do we mean by a civic university, and what would you expect to happen if universities actually try to be civic. And then there might be a more discursive piece of work for an academic audience in the form of a journal article. And there may be other things alongside that as well. But the point is that it's not the theory of civic change that's the key thing. It's how people use it. And so it's there for people to take and play with and mess about with and adapt to their own circumstances. We want people to take an approach which is very much about not here's the answer to all our problems, but here's a tool that we can start to use to address some of the issues we face. And we'll use it where it's useful, and where it's not useful, we won't use it. So we're really interested in feedback all the time. We're especially interested in practical feedback, which is about we've tried to use it and this was our experience. We're less interested in the kind of how do we get to the best theory possible, although we'd be very interested in speaking to people who've got ideas on that. But we're much more interested in how do we use this theory to enable universities and their leaders and their partners to have really meaningful conversations about what it means to be civic in their place, what kind of changes do they want to see and how are they going to happen. And just to kind of put that in context, we have a situation where 1 in 5 local authorities in the UK are in danger of going bust. We have universities themselves that face big financial problems. We've got a health service that faces huge financial problems. So if we want to achieve good for the places that we live in, we need to work out how we're going to face those challenges. And this is just a tiny little part of that process of facing those challenges. But we need to have those conversations seriously about how we're going to do it, because if we just wait for some new government to come and sort it out, or for something else to happen that will sort it out, from some miraculous upturn in the economy, it ain't going to happen. The starting point for all of this really is the needs of the communities that we work with, and how can we be the best organisations and institutions we can in the cities we live in for the good of the people who live there.
Great words to end our conversation today, Julian. Thank you very much for talking to me today. And you'll be able to find out more about Julian and Craser's work and about the Theory of Civic Change and all the work of the NCIA programme on our website. You'll find a link to it in the text that accompanies this podcast. As Julian was saying, we'd really like to hear from our listeners and the readers of our output. So if you've got any queries or questions about the Theory of Civic Change or any of the NCIA programme's work, please do contact us. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, why not subscribe and check out our other CiviCast episodes, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts, as they say, and also on YouTube. We'll have another episode of CiviCast ready for you very soon. But until then, thank you very much for listening.